Welcome back to part 2 of our series where we are making API requests using TSQL and SQL Server. In our last video, we basically built the foundation we needed in order to make a request. Wasn't anything super complicated at this point. We didn't do anything like a dynamic query or anything like that. We just kind of had a URL that was already pre-built and we just made that request. We talked a little bit about kind of the error that you run into if you just normally try to print that response text that's sent back to us after we make our request. And we found out that if we just insert it directly into a table, we actually can bypass that problem altogether. And then from that point, we can start parsing the actual JSON string. And so that's what we're going to do in this video. In this video, we're going to start parsing the JSON string, which is fun, kind of. So JSON, I'm not going to go into a crazy ton of detail with JSON just because I do have a couple videos dedicated to that. It is kind of a large topic, but I'm going to try to tell you just enough so that way you're not completely lost as I'm writing my code. Additionally, I do want to let you know I'm probably going to copy some code I've already pre-made just to kind of make things easier and kind of speed up the process. But anything I do copy, I will make sure to share it with you. So all we were doing here is we were selecting the value we just inserted. And we can see that the information that was inserted is literally just a massive JSON string. I mean, depending obviously on the request, I mean, it could be very, very large. You know, Alpha Advantage, not crazy large, but, you know, still decent. And really all it's in here is just some stock data. So normally, if it was a really, 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 really simple JSON string, all you would have to do is you would just say select star from, we're going to say Openjson, so Openjson, and then we're going to do select star from @JSON. So really, all that's supposed to be here is the actual JSON string itself. In my particular example, my JSON string is currently in a table, so all this is going to do is it's going to return that JSON string. But the normal syntax is you just provide the JSON string. Additionally, there's explicitly defining the structure, and then there's implicitly defining the structure. If you use a with clause, that is explicitly defining the structure. If you don't use with, you're not explicitly defining the structure. And if you don't explicitly define the structure, a couple variables will be returned back to you. Okay, perfect. So what's returned back to you if you do not explicitly define the structure is a key value, a value, and a type value. So the key is simply the key of each dictionary, depending on how nested it is. In this case, the Alpha Advantage is kind of nested, but not too bad. The value is the value associated with that key, and the type is the type of JSON object it is. In this case, 5 represents objects. So you have array, object, boolean, string, so on and so on. Again, we'll cover that when we get to that point. But this is if we don't explicitly define the structure. If you don't explicitly define the structure, good luck parsing it, because the reality is you're probably not going to be able to do it. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to kind of go step by step and go one level at a time, explicitly defining each portion of our JSON structure. And it's not that hard, but again, it does kind of require you to understand the actual structure of your JSON. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some code that I already have written up, and we're just going to kind of talk through it. Additionally, I do want to mention something to people because I haven't mentioned it yet. You cannot use Openjson if you don't have compatibility level 130. So unfortunately, this would require you to have a certain version of SQL Server. And if you don't have that version of SQL Server, Openjson is not there. There's other JSON functions that are there, but Openjson is not there, unfortunately. We'll kind of cover that as we get there. I don't want to really necessarily set the stage and then crush people's hopes, but there's kind of things we can do, but we're just really limited. So in this case, what I've done is I've used the with statement to define explicitly the structure of my JSON string, at least at the highest level. At the highest level, I have two other dictionaries. I have a time series 5-minute, and then I have a metadata. And that kind of makes sense because if you see right here, that's each key. Because each one of these is a JSON string itself, it's very important that I define it as nvarchar max as JSON. Otherwise, if we try to go to the next level, it's not going to work. So if the object that you're specifying and explicitly defining is a JSON string, you must define it as nvarchar max and as JSON. Otherwise, you can use other data types. So if I do that, let's see what we get. So here, we don't have that key value pair anymore. We now just have the actual dictionary itself and the other dictionary that we've defined. So we are now one level lower. If we want to keep going and keep basically parsing this until we reach the actual values, we're going to have to do some tricks. It's not necessarily a trick, but it's just showing you that sometimes, depending on what you're trying to do, it might be a little bit different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to parse the metadata dictionaries first. So this one right here, I want to grab all the information from that one. In order to do that, in order to make it, I guess, what would be considered a relational format or a table format, I'm going to do cross apply. So the way cross apply works is it's going to say, whatever is the result of whatever we do here, I want you to apply the result for each row in my table. That's really all it's doing. So whatever you get from here, I just want you to apply it to each row in my table. Now, when we do that, we now kind of have two different, I would say, mini tables in a sense. We've got this little mini table and we've got this little mini table. And so if I select all the columns from both mini tables, what do you think it's gonna look like? Well, it's just gonna be a bunch of different stuff. You'll notice that in this case, the metadata dictionary is actually just one row deep. So there's not a lot of information there, but it did parse each level of information. So there was some information, there was some symbol, there was a last refresh, and some other information as well. Technically speaking, you do not have to define this as nvarchar max. I was just kind of being safe because I really didn't know what kind of data it was. And so if I don't know, I just tend to default to nvarchar max. But say it was a number, for example, and you knew 100% sure it was a float. There's nothing wrong with defining it as a float then. In fact, I encourage you to do that. But all we've done at this point is we've done cross apply. We've gone one layer deeper on the metadata dictionary. And more importantly, with each of my with statements, I've given it an alias. It is important that you give it an alias because that will help you up here when you decide which columns you actually want to show the user, because there's not a requirement that says you have to show every little one. Now the tricky part, because let's just be honest, things never are simple. The Alpha Vantage API, unfortunately, is a little bit messy. It's not super messy, but it's good to kind of know what's going on. So again, it might be kind of hard to see, but if you notice here, we understand that this time series 5-minute JSON string is just a collection of more JSON strings. Each one of those JSON strings has a key that allows you to access the information that belongs to it. The problem is this key is not consistent across all of the actual JSON values. It changes. The key is representing each 5-minute interval. And so this was a little bit tricky when it came to parsing it because I had to do a little bit of a workaround where I had the key and then I would have to reference the key as it was parsing it. So what I decided to do was kind of what I was doing up here. It's almost like a combination of doing this and doing a cross apply. So all I did is I did an open JSON on the metadata time series 5 minutes. So the result of this parse, I'm going to grab that portion and I just do an Openjson. Remember that if I do Openjson, it just returns a key, a value, and a type. So when I do that, kind of interesting at this point, right? I'm going to try to see if I can. You'll notice that we'll have actual each key. You'll see each key for each one of these intraday ones. So we have a key, a value, and a type. The type is 5, which represents that it's basically an object. We have the value, so the actual value that's associated with that key. But here's the neat part. We have a key. We can now leverage this key to unwrap each one of these little guys right here. So it's really important that we now have that. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do another cross apply, but now I'm going to reference the value of that Openjson. So I'm going to reference the value, so that column. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to unwrap each of those values. So I now have a way where I've gotten my key, I've gotten my value, and I can just unwrap the value because I have each key that belongs with it. And again, I've defined each one of these as n varchar max. You could technically, if you wanted to, do float or whatever it is. It's really up to you. But at the end of the day, let's just take all the important information and see what we get. Perfect. I'm going to move this down a little bit. So all I'm doing is I'm basically picking and choosing which columns I want to select from each with statement. So because I have multiple Openjsons, I can now just kind of pick and choose and say, I want the column from that one, I want the column from that one, and I want that. So two things. A, it does pay if you give your alias name something meaningful, because God forbid you don't. It's going to be a pain trying to get all that information. And then additionally, you can also rename your columns. So for example, I don't like the one.open. I just say, just tell me it's open price. I don't care. But you'll notice I'm technically referencing the result of 3 Openjson responses. And so I'm getting the ticker symbol, the time interval, the date ID, and then all the price data, open, high, low, close, and volume. So ultimately, at the end of the day, this is how it should look like. You'll have a symbol, a time interval, a date ID, and then you'll have the open price, the high price, the decimal, the close price, and the volume. And with that being said, you have officially made your first request, and you have parsed the result of that first request. So this is making API requests, parsing the data, and then from here, it's kind of like the open row set with Excel. You could insert it directly into a table. There's a ton of other stuff you can do, but you've now got it in a format where it's easy to work with. And you've got it more in a traditional relational sense, where now you can make this transition of working with APIs from SQL Server 5 times easier. And then this whole concept of JSON data isn't necessarily restricted to other languages like Python. You can now handle it all directly from SQL Server. So with that being said, I'm going to close off the video. That's the end of it. If you have any questions about kind of what we did today, feel free to put them down in the comments below, and I'll try to get back to you as always. And then also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate support. And if you're not already, hopefully this video encourages you to subscribe to the channel, so that way you're going to get regular updates as we release new videos on topics related to a whole host of programming languages. So very cool stuff. Thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in our next series.